Okay, welcome back. Here's our last video, hopefully. I won't lose power in the middle of it. Okay, here we go. I have E1. D is the exact same thing. So you're going to position your first fabric down. And again, since these are symmetrical, it really doesn't matter which side the light or dark green goes on. Use your cardstock or a ruler to get a nice crease line. Position that down. And then you want to trim so that you have 1/4 of an inch on. Again, this is a great spot for a 1/4 inch, or sorry, add a 1/4 ruler. It really allows you to have to be a lot faster because you're not worried about lining that up, because the ledge in that fold, or that ledge in the ruler, just lines right up to that paper. Okay, so I'm going to pin this into place. Try not to move it. Grab my next fabric, put them right sides together, right? Fabric always goes right sides together. And then I'm going to open that up and then take it over to my sewing machine and stitch all the way through. There we go. So there is both of those blocks. So I'm just going to set that there. So it looks like my selvage is just barely out of there. So I do generally like to cut these salvages off, because no matter what, these holes will never go away. And we just don't want them in our project. So it is a good idea to cut those off before you use your fabric for anything, so that there is just no way it's ever going to get put in your project. So there, I pressed that one. So now we have 2 here. So this one's my favorite. This one's the most fun. And it also might be the most challenging. So to get started, we're going to start with A1. So and A2. So we want to fold our paper directly on the line between A1 and A2. So I'm going to use that. Okay, so now once that's folded, I can position my fabric down and pin it in place. And this is, exceedingly large for the space for the A1. So when I fold this back, you can clearly see on all sides there's plenty of fabric. So since I am stitching on the A1 and A2 line, this is when I'm going to go ahead and use my ruler to trim off that extra seam allowance there. So now I have a perfect 1/4 of an inch. So now, because triangles are tricky, I want to show you this. You are going to line up your fabrics right sides together, line them up, and now what you want to do is make sure that you have enough fabric to cover this. So I'm going to just draw. I know it might be hard to see in the video. This is the line which is actually going to be in my quilt block. So that is the area at which I need to make sure that that black fabric is large enough for. So I very obviously made this way too large, which is definitely what we want. Okay, that is the biggest #1 mistake in foundation paper piecing, is cutting a piece that's too small. So it is a little bit more wasteful, but it is so much less hassle in the end. So I want to make sure that I have enough fabric, and I clearly do. And now I'm going to stitch across the A1 and A2 line. So I'm going to take that over to my sewing machine, stitch all the way across. Now I don't have to press between, I do have to press between A2 and A3, because these seams are right next to each other and they'll affect each other. If it was A1 or A2 and A4, then since these seams are not affecting each other, I won't have to worry about pressing in between. So once your fabric is secured, you don't have to use your pin anymore, and you can use your finger press, you can use your seam roller, or you can use an iron. Just either way, whatever method you like, just to make sure that that gets nice and crisp and flat. So now to do A3, you will have to pull the paper back, and that's okay. So you can pull the paper back and then use your cardstock or ruler and fold that paper. Once you fold the paper, you can use your ruler and cut your extra seam allowance away. Once that is away, then you can take another one of your pieces and line that up. Let's see, since I have a solid, you can line that up anyway, because there's no right or right song, no right or wrong side. And now I can check to make sure that there is enough fabric on all sides before I stitch. So I'm going to stitch all the way across. And that is that one. And again, I'm going to press that open. Nice and crisply. Oops. Make sure that there are no, I'm not pressing it down like this. I want to make sure that that is pulled back as much as possible. So now that A1 and A2, so now we're going to work on A4. And again, you will have to pull that paper off the fabric, and that's totally okay. And so now I have that pressed nicely back so it exposes my seam allowance, and then I can cut a perfect seam allowance. Doo-doo. And so now I'm going to line up my black fabric with the edge. Make sure that I have enough fabric on the sides. Oh, look at that one, looks really tight. So I'm going to move that up here. Make sure that I have enough fabric on both sides. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to take that over here and I'm going to stitch all the way across the paper. Okay, so this square and a square block is really fun, and it is really common in sewing. Foundation paper piecing is the best way to make sure that you don't lose any of your points once you sew it together. So I'm going to press that. And then I'm going to have to rip both of these papers to get to be able to press on that fold line there. Okay, so now using my straight line, make sure I ripped enough of that fabric. I also want to fold this guy. And so now that it's folded, I can use my ruler and trim my seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. Now that it's 1/4 of an inch, I can use that to line up with my, so I can see that it's covering it. And I can line it up right here. And for one more final check, I'm going to see if there's enough fabric. That looks good. A little close, but it's good. Okay, so now I'm going to fold that back, bring it over to my sewing machine, stitch all the way across. Okay, so now I have this beautiful square and a square. So it always looks crazy and not so great until you get to the trimming part. I'm going to press that real quick. I'm going to show you trimming my foundation paper piecing segments. So this is segment A, or block A, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to trim just inside. I want to make it so that there's just a tad bit more than 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to pick this up so that you can see this a little bit better. So right here, it is lined up perfectly on the 1/4 of an inch line on my ruler. What I want to do is move it so that it's just slightly bigger than 1/4 of an inch. Because the paper is really bulky, it causes the seams to fold a little bit differently and take up a little bit more of your seam allowance. So I like to trim it just slightly larger. So I'm going to keep it into position, and then I'm going to trim on both sides. This is not a... Ideally, you don't want to move that, but if I put my arm across, it'll cover the camera. Okay, so I have it trimmed on that side, and then I'm going to rotate my piece, and again, do the same thing so that it's ever so slightly larger than 1/4 of an inch, and it's consistent and square. Here we go. There. And now, when we flip it over, we're going to say, ah, oh, that looks so good. Square and a square. So that is how I trimmed that one. And then we're also going to trim our E and D, and I'll show you how I did that one. So again, I'm going to try to trim 2 sides at once so that it saves a little bit of time. So here's one, And then here's the other. And then I'm going to pick up, if you have a rotating mat, it's going to save you a lot of time. And then trim here and trim there. There's that one. Look how nice and pretty it looks. Going again. Oops. Okay. I don't know if you can see this completely on the screen here. Okay. That corner is done. And see how it trims our paper at the same time. So I like to have a separate rotary cutter for paper piecing and regular piecing or cutting, so that the blade, you know, it just gets so dull cutting paper. So there we go, there. And again, when I'm rotary cutting, I always have my fingers up high. I say it's like a spider, not like a pancake, so that if the rotary cutter ever goes over the edge, if your fingers are down flat like this, there's a lot of finger to cut. If they're up like this, hopefully it hits your knuckle before it hits your finger. So it's just a little bit safer that way. So now I'm going to show you how to join your A segment to the E and D. So you do want the fabrics to be alternating. So I have dark here, light here, dark there. So after I have that in position the way that I want it to go, I'm going to fold it so that it's right sides together. And whenever I'm checking paper piecing, I do like to take a pin, and just to make sure that it's going to line up properly, I'm going to place it directly in that point right there. So here's my square point. I'm going to push it directly. I'm going to line up my fabrics first. I'm going to push it directly in and make sure that it comes out on the seam allowance on the other side. So you do want to make sure that your pin is straight, not tilted too much one way or the other. That way you can check your seams before you sew them, because it's so much easier to check them that way than it is to have to seam rip. Nobody likes doing that. Okay, so once I have it pinned in place, you can just do it one more check and make sure that's lining up directly on the seam allowance line going all the way across. So that looks really good to me. I'm going to bring it right over to my sewing machine. I'm going to lift off the clip there, and then again stitch from one side of the paper all the way across to the other, directly on that line. Okay, so I stitched all the way across, and it should line up on the seam allowance all the way on the other side. So that looks really, really good. And look how perfect that point is. It is directly there. So we didn't sew too much so that we lost the point. We sewed perfect amount. So now we're going to do the exact same thing, but we want to flip so that we have alternating fabric placement. So you can line up your fabric like this, clip it into place. These clips are so fantastic and helpful. And then you want to check your seam to make sure that that's going to line up perfectly. So that looks a little off. So I'm going to shift that down just a little bit. Reposition it, and then check that one more time so that when I push that through, it is right on that seam. So we want to see that directly on that line. Okay, once I get that into position, I'm going to take it over to my sewing machine and stitch away. Okay, so then when I open it up, you should have perfect points on both sides. So that is your middle row. So awesome. So then if you haven't trimmed your top and bottom segments, this is a good time to do that so that we can stitch it to the next one. So to trim this, I'm going to try to move the camera just a tiny bit. I'm going to use a larger ruler so that it can go across the, oh, not even that one. So it can go across the entire length. So I'm going to show you that right up here. Okay, so you're going to use a large ruler so it can go across the entire length at the entire, so you can do the entire seam allowance. So again, I make it so that it's just barely inside or barely on the outside, so that my seam allowance is slightly larger than 1/4 inch. So I'm going to move this over to my cutting area and trim, and I do like to trim both sides at a time. So I line up the corner, and I will trim this like this. And you can't see it too well. So there, I trimmed both this side and this side. So now I'm going to rotate this and trim both of these sides. So I'm going to line that up with my ruler. He has your ruler should have a 1/4 inch marking. And it just saves a little bit of time doing both sides at a time. So there's one and the other. Okay, so there is, it just looks so good, right? Okay, so there's my middle segment, my top segment. You're going to watch your fabric placement. If you need to rotate it, rotate it. This, I don't want it that way. I want it this way where it's alternating. And again, we're going to do the same pin method. So with paper piecing, you can't always control which way your seams are going. So you want to use clips to position your pieces together. So you can see how very little of the paper I have actually left past my seam allowance. So it's just a tad. Okay, so we're going to take our pin. I like to use the glass head fine pins. They go through the fabric a lot easier. So what we're going to watch for is lining up this seam here. So when we stitch here, we want to make sure that this is nice and lined up. So these two black pieces meet directly there, and then these two are directly across from each other. So it's right, perfect in line. So that's what we're aiming for. So if I put this directly in here, it should come out on the point there. And this is off. I don't know if you can see that, but that is not quite lined up. So I'm going to reposition it so that it will line up nicely. So I'm going to hold that in place. Sometimes when you look down from the top, you can also see a little bit better whether or not it's going to line up. And so when you push directly straight in, it should come directly on the seam allowance on the other side. So I'm going to move that. There, that looks better. I'm going to adjust my clip so that when I push that in, it's going to come out directly on the line there. So I'm going to grab one more clip to make sure that that stays where I want it to. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to push in the corner, and it should be directly on the line there. So that looks too far, so we'll put it down a little bit more. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to grab another clip, and then it should be the same all the way down. So anytime you poke on the seam allowance on one side and you turn it over, it should hit the, it's because it's trimmed a little too far. Looks like that is not a great trim job. I'm going to move that down there. That looks better. Okay, so it is important to have that trimmed. That is way too far, which is why this is not lining up perfectly. So ideally, you have the same amount on both sides. So when you are checking your seam allowance, these should be lined up and it should be perfect up here. So I know that's kind of hard to see, but there we go. So just like that. So you want to have that nice and lined up. Now I'm going to go ahead and stitch this all the way across. Now I'm going to get to my sides. Before I get to my clips, I'm going to try to move them out of the way and make sure I'm tucking the paper down underneath the foot. And so the advantage of sewing on this side is that I can see exactly where that triangle should go. And I want to make sure that that works all the way across. Okay. Okay. So when you see your stitching line, it should line up all the way on there, and it should line up on your seam line all the way across. So you can see how the stitching line is right on there. So that when you open it up, you should have it lined up really nice. Looks like I need to redo that a little bit. It is not quite perfect. So it looks like my whole block needs to be shifted up. So I'm going to redo that so that it's not off, because I want my block to be nice and perfect. So with foundation paper piecing, because you have such a short stitch length, it can be a lot more frustrating to seam rip, especially because it's on the paper. So looks like I tried to get away with not trimming that, and it really did not work out so great. So I'm going to redo that. I really like these surgical seam rippers. They make it pretty nice to and relatively painless to seam rip when you need to. So you always get these extra flyaways when you seam rip, but they'll come off really easily. You can use the end of a pencil or just a regular pencil eraser, and it will pull all those little threads out. I'm going to retrim my block here because I didn't notice that until I got to pinning. Oops. Oops. One more. Okay. Now that's nice and straight, and this one nice and straight. So again, I'm going to check my positioning of my fabric, make sure that it's alternating, put right sides together, and then try to use my clips and line that up really, really nice. So I'm going to line that one up there. So I really want that to be a nice and perfect block. So you can see from the top how well that should line up. And then do the last check with your pin, so that when you stitch through, it's going to line up on that line. So it looks like that's not up far enough. Okay, I'm just going to pin that because I put my clips too far away. Here's my next one. Okay, checking the last one here, making sure that lines up. I'm going to clip it there. Okay, so now that I have the last one. All right, so let's go ahead and check our seam here. So it should line up right on the corner. That one does. And again, right on the corner. That looks way better. So I'm going to do that. So here we go. So when I am sewing the blocks, that looks 1,000 times better. So there we go. Since these are going to be sitting around for a year before we sew them into the quilt, what I like to do is stitch all the way around the entire perimeter of the block, just like this one. So you can see my white thread around the edges to make sure that it is not, these seams right here are not going to come out. So, and it also ensures that this fabric along the edges is not going to stretch, and it's going to stay nice and perfect. So that is how you sew this block. It's the exact same method to sew the last piece on with this one here. So you're just going to always make sure that you're checking your fabric placement, and that is how you foundation paper piece this block. If you guys have any other questions, make sure you just give me a call. I'm always happy to help. Thank you for participating.